In July 2016, inside a Cambridge boardroom, the most ubiquitous technology empire in British history was sold to a Japanese conglomerate for $32 billion. By that morning, the company did not manufacture a single physical chip, yet its architecture powered 95% of the world's smartphones. From the Apple iPhone to the Android ecosystem, nearly every mobile device relied on a processor design that began decades earlier inside a small British desktop computer. The buyout meant the United Kingdom permanently lost ownership of the foundation of modern mobile computing. Global developers kept their platform, and manufacturers kept their supply chains. But the nation that engineered the architecture no longer controlled it. The paradox is that this technology did not disappear because it failed. It was lost because it became too essential to remain a localized British asset. Years earlier, the home computer that birthed this chip had already been relegated to classroom cupboards. But the real story of ARM is not just the story of a corporate acquisition. It is the story of how Britain built the hardware of the future, only to lose the system that turned invention into scale. Every week, we tell the stories of British machines, platforms, shops, software houses, and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Cambridge in 1978. The story of ARM does not begin in a Silicon Valley cleanroom or an American corporate campus. It begins in December 1978, inside a rented office above a market square in Cambridge, England. At the time, Britain was experiencing a subtle technological awakening. While the national economy was burdened by industrial friction, energy crises, and high inflation, a quiet concentration of engineering talent was forming around the University of Cambridge. Two men, Hermann Hauser, an Austrian-born physicist with a doctorate from Cambridge, and Chris Curry, a former executive at Clive Sinclair's Sinclair Radionics, founded a tiny venture named Cambridge Processor Unit Ltd., which soon adopted the commercial name Acorn Computers. In 1978, personal computing in the United Kingdom was fragmented and expensive. Most British households and small businesses had never seen a working microcomputer, a small computer built around a single microprocessor for home or educational use. The market was dominated by costly American imports like the Commodore PET and the Tandy TRS-80, machines priced far beyond the budget of average British families, local authorities, or comprehensive schools. If computing was to enter everyday British life, it required a domestic machine designed for local conditions, local budgets, and local classrooms. Acorn's early engineers built small, modular circuit boards for local hobbyists, relying on the MOS Technology 6502 processor, the main chip that performs calculations and executes instructions inside a computer. The 6502 was an inexpensive 8-bit silicon chip that had already powered early American devices, but Acorn's team realized its true potential lay in offering a complete, accessible system to the British public. The decisive turning point arrived in early 1981, driven by a state-backed cultural mandate. Alarmed by national studies suggesting the United Kingdom was falling behind the United States and Japan in industrial automation and digital literacy, the British Broadcasting Corporation announced the BBC Computer Literacy Project. The initiative aimed to pair a nationwide television series about computing with an official, standardized microcomputer that would be adopted across British education. The BBC issued a stringent technical specification for the official machine. It needed advanced graphics, networking capabilities, robust expansion ports, and a high-performance programming language. Clive Sinclair submitted a design based on his inexpensive Sinclair ZX81, but Acorn's engineering team worked through an extraordinary 4-day weekend in Cambridge to build a functioning prototype named the Proton. When BBC executives visited the Cambridge workshop, the prototype executed its test commands flawlessly. Acorn won the contract. In late 1981, the machine was officially launched as the BBC microcomputer, universally known as the BBC Micro. The commercial impact was immediate and overwhelming. Priced at $235 for the entry-level Model A and $335 for the more capable Model B, the BBC Micro was not cheap compared to domestic competitors. Yet, backed by government subsidies from the Department of Industry, local education authorities across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland began placing massive orders. By 1982, over 80% of British secondary schools and thousands of primary classrooms had installed at least one cream-colored BBC Micro on a dedicated wooden trolley or ICT desk. For millions of British school pupils, the BBC Micro was their first physical interaction with digital technology. The machine featured a solid black keyboard with distinctive red function keys encased in a durable, heavy-duty plastic shell built to survive classroom wear and tear. It connected directly to domestic CRT monitors or standard classroom television sets. In thousands of school computer rooms, lessons began with the mechanical clatter of keys and the distinctive, high-pitched squeal of a cassette tape. Magnetic tape used by early computers to load and save programs through audio signals. Loading a simple math game or graphics demonstration from tape could take 4 minutes of patient waiting. Later, as school budgets expanded, classrooms upgraded to the 5.25-inch floppy disk, a removable magnetic storage format used to save files, software, and operating systems far faster than magnetic tape. The BBC Micro was underpinned by BBC Basic, an exceptionally clean and structured programming language integrated into the computer's ROM. Unlike home computers designed purely for playing video games, the BBC Micro invited pupils to inspect its internal mechanics. Teachers used it to demonstrate geometry, sound generation, simple accounting, and automated physics experiments. In staff rooms and school corridors, a generation of British educators realized that computing was no longer a distant industrial tool reserved for corporate mainframes, but an accessible public utility. Between 1981 and 1984, Acorn delivered more than 500,000 BBC microcomputers. The company's revenue surged from under $1 million in 1979 to over $90 million by 1983. Acorn expanded rapidly, moving into new headquarters in Cambridge, opening international offices and listing its shares on the unlisted securities market in London. In the eyes of the British press and the technology sector, Cambridge was no longer just an ancient university city. It was the heart of Silicon Fen, a growing hub of high-technology innovation. Yet beneath this spectacular domestic success, a fundamental hardware bottleneck was quietly developing. By 1983, Acorn's engineering team was planning its next-generation desktop computer, a machine that could replace the BBC Micro and compete with emerging business desktop computers from IBM and Apple. But the 8-bit 6502 processor that powered the BBC Micro was reaching its absolute physical limit. It operated at a clock speed of just 2 megahertz, capable of addressing only 64 kilobytes of memory without complex memory bank switching. Acorn evaluated the next generation of 16-bit and 32-bit commercial processors available on the global market, including Motorola's 68000 and Intel's 80286. But the Cambridge team found these foreign chips complex, expensive, slow to execute certain instructions, and demanding in their power consumption. None of them offered the fluid, instantaneous response that Acorn's chief architects demanded for their new operating system concepts. Acorn had built a national computer empire on existing off-the-shelf silicon. But to build the classroom and office computer of the future, a small team of Cambridge engineers realized they would first have to do something almost unheard of for a modest British desktop manufacturer. They would have to design their own 32-bit microchip from scratch. In late 1983, inside Acorn's research facility on Market Hill in Cambridge, the engineering team faced an inescapable architectural wall. The company was led technical-wise by Sophie Wilson, a brilliant computer scientist who had written BBC Basic, and Steve Ferber, a gifted hardware engineer who had designed the internal electronics of the BBC Micro. Together, they were tasked with defining the silicon architecture for Acorn's next decade. To build a modern computer capable of running complex graphic interfaces and advanced software, Acorn needed a 32-bit processor, a microprocessor capable of processing data in 32-bit memory blocks rather than the restrictive 8-bit blocks of the previous era. They systematically evaluated the commercial chips offered by major American semiconductor manufacturers, including Motorola's 68000 and Intel's 80286. What they found dismayed them. These chips were built on CISC architecture, complex instruction set computing, a chip design philosophy where processors rely on large, intricate sets of built-in commands. Because each complex command required multiple clock cycles to execute, The chips were physically large, generated significant heat, required expensive support circuitry, and ran far too slowly for the fluid computing experience Acorn wanted to deliver. The breakthrough came when Herman Hauser handed Wilson and Ferber academic papers published by the University of California, Berkeley, and Stanford University. Researchers like David Patterson were championing an alternative philosophy: RISC, reduced instruction set computer. RISC theory argued that instead of overloading a processor with hundreds of complex, rarely used commands, a chip should use a small, highly streamlined set of simple instructions. By making every instruction simple enough to execute in a single clock cycle, one beat of the chip's internal electronic timer, a RISC processor could achieve unprecedented execution speeds while using a fraction of the hardware logic. Acorn's management made a radical decision. Unable to afford the tens of millions of pounds and hundreds of engineers that American chip firms poured into mainframe-driven computer design, Acorn assigned a core team of just 4 engineers to design a proprietary 32-bit RISC chip from scratch. Lacking expensive computer-aided design workstations, Wilson wrote software simulators and Ferber laid out circuit diagrams using Acorn's existing BBC microcomputers. The constraints of the British office became their greatest advantage. Because the team was small and equipped with modest design tools, they were forced to keep the chip layout exceptionally clean and simple. Instead of adding complex hardware features, they relentlessly eliminated unnecessary circuits. When the design was finalized, the instruction logic contained just 25,000 transistors, a microchip component that acts as a microscopic electronic switch to control electrical current. By comparison, Intel's competing 802H6 processor contained over 130,000 transistors. This extreme structural simplicity created 2 profound physical consequences. First, the tiny transistor count meant the physical silicon die, the small slice of semiconductor material containing the integrated circuit, was exceptionally small, making it remarkably cheap to manufacture. Second, fewer electronic switches meant the chip required very little electrical energy to operate. Acorn named their creation the Acorn RISC machine, abbreviated as ARM. On 26 April 1985, the first physical samples of the ARM-1 microchip arrived at Cambridge in ceramic packages from the foundry of VLSI Technology in San Jose, California. Ferber and Wilson carefully mounted the chip into a prototype test board connected to a BBC micro. They turned on the power. Within seconds, the screen displayed a prompt confirming the chip was active. ARM 1000 Herunsaurn. The ARM-1 chip executed its test commands perfectly on its very first attempt, an almost unheard-of triumph in microprocessor engineering. Days later, an unintended experiment revealed the chip's true nature. While measuring the board's power consumption with an ammeter, an instrument that measures electrical current, engineers unplugged the main power supply cable connected to the ARM chip. To their complete astonishment, the processor did not shut down. The computer kept executing software without missing a beat. The ARM-1 was drawing so little power that it was running entirely on leakage current, small amounts of stray electrical current leaking through the computer's surrounding data lines. The chip consumed less than 1/10 of a watt. Without intending to, a small Cambridge team designing a desktop computer chip had accidentally engineered the most power-efficient 32-bit processor in human history. Acorn quickly refined the design into a commercial processor named the ARM-2 in 1987, integrating dedicated hardware for memory control and high-quality sound output. In June 1987, Acorn launched its new flagship computer line, the Acorn Archimedes. The Archimedes was a technical marvel. Running at a clock speed of 8 megahertz, it was widely recognized as the fastest personal computer in the world at launch, outperforming IBM-compatible PCs, Apple Macintoshes, and Commodore Amigas by a vast margin. Paired with its custom multitasking operating system, RISC-OS, software that allowed a computer to run multiple programs simultaneously in smooth desktop windows. The Archimedes offered fluid graphics, instantaneous spreadsheet updates, and high-fidelity digital audio. Yet, the economic realities of the British marketplace immediately asserted themselves. The entry-level Archimedes 305 carried a launch price of $800, while higher-end models exceeded $200. For average British families and budget-conscious local education authorities, this was a formidable sum compared to cheaper 8-bit home computers or the rapidly expanding line of home video game consoles. Acorn had engineered an extraordinary technological breakthrough, proving that a modest British company could outdesign the silicon giants of Silicon Valley. But as the late 1980s arrived, the world's most revolutionary chip architecture remained largely locked inside British classroom desktops, waiting for a global market that had not yet realized it needed it. By 1990, the Acorn Archimedes was widely respected in British education, but on the global stage, the computer hardware market was consolidating around American corporate standards. IBM-compatible personal computers running Microsoft DOS and Apple Macintosh systems were rapidly dominating offices, universities, and international retail channels. Acorn's entire hardware business, magnificent as its engineering was, remained confined largely to British classrooms and local government accounts. The ARM processor was a brilliant piece of silicon engineering, but it was trapped inside a niche British desktop platform that lacked the manufacturing volume to compete with global semiconductor giants like Intel and Motorola. Then an unexpected inquiry arrived from Cupertino, California. In the late 1980s, Apple Computer was secretly developing a revolutionary handheld digital device, a portable pocket communicator that would eventually be launched as the Apple Newton. Larry Tesler, Apple's vice president of advanced technology, realized that traditional computer chips were completely unsuitable for a battery-powered pocket device. They generated far too much heat, drained heavy batteries in minutes, and required bulky cooling fans. When Apple engineers evaluated the ARM processor, they discovered that this modest British desktop chip offered a power-to-performance ratio unlike anything in Silicon Valley. It delivered 32-bit computing speed while consuming mere milliwatts of electricity. In November 1990, a historic joint venture was executed. Acorn Computers, Apple Computer, and VLSI Technology combined resources to spin off Acorn's chip design division into a standalone independent British company. The new enterprise was named Advanced Risk Machines Limited, represented by the acronym ARM. Apple contributed $3 million in capital, VLSI provided chip fabrication tools and access to silicon foundries, and Acorn transferred 12 core engineers along with the intellectual property of the ARM architecture. The 12 founding engineers, led by a newly appointed chief executive named Robin Saxby, packed up their workstations and moved out of Acorn's central Cambridge offices. They relocated to a converted 18th century barn in Swaffham Bulbeck, a quiet village 7 miles outside Cambridge. The physical setting was surreal. Inside a rustic brick building surrounded by Cambridgeshire farmland, 12 British engineers set out to build a global microprocessor company. In winter, the barn was so cold that staff reportedly wore thick coats at their desks while debugging circuit logic. Saxby faced an immediate existential crisis. ARM had a total starting capital of less than $2 million and no factories of its own. Building a single modern semiconductor fabrication plant, a cleanroom factory used to manufacture physical microchips from silicon wafers, required over $1 billion in capital investment. Intel, Motorola, and Texas Instruments spent hundreds of millions of dollars annually maintaining massive chip foundries. ARM could not afford to manufacture a single piece of physical hardware. Saxby and his team made a radical strategic choice that would redefine the entire global technology industry. ARM would never manufacture physical chips. Instead, ARM adopted an IP licensing model, a business strategy where a company sells the intellectual property and circuit blueprints of its designs to other manufacturers rather than producing physical goods itself. ARM would design the architecture, test the logic, and write the support software in Cambridge. Global semiconductor companies would pay ARM an upfront licensing fee to access the design blueprints, plus a small royalty, a tiny cash fee, often just a few pence per chip, for every physical microchip they manufactured and sold inside their own products. In 1990, this IP licensing model was considered absurd by the tech establishment. Silicon Valley believed that real technology empires owned giant physical factories and stamped their corporate logos onto plastic computer boxes. But by refusing to build factories, ARM turned its greatest financial weakness into an insurmountable global advantage. Because ARM did not manufacture chips, It never competed with its own customers. A semiconductor maker like Texas Instruments or Samsung could take ARM's core blueprint, integrate custom graphics or radio circuits around it on a single piece of silicon, creating a system on chip, an integrated circuit that combines all core components of a computer onto a single microchip, and sell the finished processor directly to device makers. Unburdened by the multi-billion-dollar costs of running factories, ARM's small team in Cambridgeshire could focus entirely on one single objective: refining the world's most power-efficient processor architecture. Robin Saxby, ARM's chief executive, realized that the licensing model would only survive if ARM became an absolute, universal standard. If only one or two manufacturers adopted their architecture, developers would ignore it. ARM had to be everywhere. The breakthrough in global mobile communications arrived through a strategic partnership with Texas Instruments, a colossal American semiconductor manufacturer. In the mid-1990s, Texas Instruments was working closely with Nokia, a Finnish telecommunications company preparing to dominate the rollout of the new European and GSM network. GSM, Global System for Mobile Communications, was a digital cellular standard that replaced older analog networks, requiring mobile phones to digitally compress and transmit voice data in real time. Nokia's engineers faced a severe physical limitation. Processing digital audio required significant computational power, but mobile phone batteries of the era were heavy, expensive, and limited in capacity. When they tested traditional processors from established silicon giants, the chips generated too much heat and drained the battery in hours. But when they evaluated the ARM7, a new 32-bit iteration of the Cambridge design, they found a processor that delivered immense computational throughput while sipping minimal electricity. However, memory chips for mobile phones were incredibly expensive. Nokia demanded that the processor use less memory to store its software instructions. In response, ARM's engineers back in Cambridgeshire invented an architectural extension called Thumb, a clever software modification that compressed 32-bit instructions into 16-bit spaces, drastically reducing the amount of memory a mobile phone required to function without sacrificing performance. The result of this collaboration launched in December 1997, the Nokia 6110. For millions of users across the United Kingdom and Europe, the Nokia 6110 was a revelation. It had a sleek profile, a menu system that responded instantly, a battery that could last for a week on a single charge, and a pre-loaded digital game called Snake. A British professional playing Snake on a train carriage, or a teenager texting in a high-street shopping center, likely had no idea that the logic executing those pixels had been designed in a Cambridgeshire barn. Beneath the dark plastic casing, the Nokia 6110 was secretly a British computing triumph. The explosive success of Nokia fundamentally altered ARM's trajectory. As Nokia grew into the dominant mobile phone manufacturer on Earth, ARM's licensing model became a financial engine of staggering power. Because ARM earned a small royalty, a tiny percentage of the sale price, on every single physical chip manufactured by its partners, its revenue scaled automatically with the explosion of the global mobile phone market. ARM did not have to pay for plastic, glass, or assembly lines. It only sold the math. By the end of 1997, ARM was licensing its blueprints to global electronics giants, including Samsung, Sharp, Alcatel, and Sony. In April 1998, ARM Holdings floated as a public company, listing simultaneously on the London Stock Exchange and the American Nasdaq. The small team that had walked out of Acorn's offices just 8 years earlier was suddenly valued at over $260 million. By the early 2000s, ARM was no longer just a British company, it was a global ecosystem. When Apple decided to build the iPod, a portable digital music player that required extreme power efficiency to spin a miniature hard drive while decoding audio, they chose dual ARM processors. When Nintendo built the Game Boy Advance handheld console, they used an ARM chip. When manufacturers built digital cameras, broadband routers, and car braking systems, they licensed ARM. In a global electronics market where an American or Japanese corporation might own the factory, the screen, and the brand, the right architecture did not merely run software. It decided how a battery survived the day, how a phone fit into a pocket, how communication became truly mobile, and who ultimately held the foundational blueprint of the 21st century. By 2005, over 1 billion physical chips containing an ARM core were being manufactured globally every single year. The architecture born inside the Acorn Archimedes desktop computer had become the undisputed standard for mobile computing. Yet as the ARM architecture reached global dominance, a strange paradox had formed. ARM's blueprints were everywhere, but the ARM logo was entirely invisible to the public. The consumer bought an Apple device, a Sony camera, or a Samsung phone. The architecture was British, but the final hardware belonged to the world. And back in Cambridge, the British home computer company that had originally invented the entire architecture was quietly running out of time. The global ecosystem had found its processor. The desktop machine that birthed it was about to be left behind. The first crack did not appear in a corporate boardroom or a semiconductor foundry. It happened quietly in the mid-1990s inside a British school ICT room. A teacher or a local education authority buyer looked at an aging Acorn Archimedes desktop computer, evaluated the available budget, and made a purely pragmatic decision. When it was time to upgrade the classroom, they did not order the next generation of Acorn hardware. Instead, they bought a generic, beige, IBM-compatible personal computer running Microsoft Windows. The Acorn machine still worked perfectly. Its ARM processor was technically superior, generating less heat and executing instructions with remarkable efficiency. Its RISC OS operating system was fluid and multitasking. But the market around the machine had fundamentally changed. By the mid-1990s, the global computing industry had consolidated around a crushing American standard known as Wintel, the combined inescapable dominance of Microsoft Windows software and Intel processors. Wintel was not a single company. It was a vast standardized ecosystem. Because hundreds of different global manufacturers built IBM-compatible PCs using the exact same generic components, manufacturing costs plummeted. A local British education authority could buy a fleet of standardized PCs for a fraction of the cost of bespoke Acorn machines. Simultaneously, the political and educational philosophy regarding school computing shifted. The BBC Computer Literacy Project of the 1980s had been designed to teach British pupils how a computer actually worked, how to write code, how to control hardware, and how to understand programming logic. But as the 1990s progressed, the focus shifted towards preparing pupils for the modern corporate office. Schools no longer wanted to teach programming. They wanted to teach IT skills. That meant teaching pupils how to use Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, and standard web browsers. Acorn found itself trapped in a fatal systemic loop. Because schools and offices were migrating to Windows, software developers stopped writing new educational and business programs for Acorn's RISC OS. Because there was no new software, fewer schools bought Acorn machines. Once that loop broke, the decline accelerated rapidly. A bizarre and tragic divergence had opened up in the British technology landscape. On one hand, ARM, the spin-off company that only designed chip architecture, was becoming a global phenomenon, its blueprints being licensed by Texas Instruments, Nokia, and Samsung. ARM was highly profitable because it did not have to manufacture plastic cases, source heavy glass CRT monitors, or maintain retail supply chains. On the other hand, Acorn Computers, the company that had originally invented the ARM architecture, the company that had taught Britain to code, was bleeding money. Acorn was still chained to the brutal reality of hardware manufacturing. They had to build physical machines, box them, ship them on lorries, and sell them in a market completely dominated by cheap American and Asian PC clones. By 1998, the strain broke the company. The home computer market that Britain had pioneered in the 1980s was definitively over. In a boardroom restructuring, Acorn was entirely dismantled. Its incredibly valuable shares in ARM holdings were distributed to shareholders. The remaining physical computer business, the division that actually built desktop machines, was sold off for just $1.5 million to a company named Stanhope plc before being restructured and largely shut down. The brand that had defined British public service computing vanished from the high street. The Acorn logo, once a symbol of educational promise stamped on hundreds of thousands of classroom machines, was reduced to a memory. The hardware division was gone. The operating system became a niche product maintained by a dedicated but small group of enthusiasts. The irony was profound. Britain had engineered the most efficient processor architecture on Earth. But to make that architecture succeed globally, it had to be separated from the British physical computer that birthed it. The machine died so the chip could live. Yet as the 21st century began, ARM was not safe simply because it had conquered the mobile phone. The British desktop computer had been killed by the sheer weight of global manufacturing standards. The chip architecture that outlived it was about to face a different, far more insidious vulnerability of scale. The architecture remained British. The global ecosystem that relied upon it, however, was growing too large for Britain to hold on to. While Acorn Computers was systematically dismantled and its physical machines relegated to loft boxes and charity shop electronic shelves, ARM Holdings experienced an entirely opposite trajectory. By the late 2000s, ARM was no longer merely a successful British intellectual property firm. It was the invisible foundation of the global mobile revolution. Every time a consumer in London, New York, or Tokyo slid their finger across a smartphone touchscreen, they were interacting with silicon logic born in a Cambridgeshire barn. By 2010, annual shipments of ARM-based processors had surpassed 6 billion units. When Apple designed the custom A4 chip for the original iPad and iPhone 4, they chose an ARM Cortex architecture. When Google launched the Android ecosystem with hardware partners like Qualcomm, MediaTek, and Samsung, virtually every single device relied on ARM cores. ARM had become the very fabric of the internet era. For years, British politicians and financial analysts pointed to ARM as the ultimate proof that the United Kingdom could successfully transition from heavy manufacturing to a high-value, knowledge-based economy. ARM did not need to run expensive fabrication plants. It sold pure intelligence. It was framed as the undisputed crown jewel of British technology. While older British computing names like Sinclair, Amstrad, and ICL had vanished from the high street or been absorbed by foreign rivals, ARM had seemingly beaten the system. It proved Britain could lead the world without needing to stamp plastic computer cases or manage high-street retail logistics. But in the interconnected global semiconductor market, intellectual property had no national loyalty. As a publicly traded company listed on the London Stock Exchange, ARM was subject to the inescapable pressures of global financial markets. Though its headquarters remained in Cambridge and its workforce was anchored by British engineers, its shares were widely held by international institutional investors who valued shareholder return above national industrial strategy. By the mid-2010s, the global technology landscape was shifting toward massive capital concentration. Designing a new generation of microchips required billions of pounds in upfront research and development for every new architectural leap as circuit sizes shrank to nanometer scales. At the same time, massive technology conglomerates in Asia and the United States were sitting on mountains of cash, looking to secure absolute control over the fundamental infrastructure of the digital age. ARM's IP licensing model, the very engine that had allowed it to conquer the world without building factories, now made it structurally vulnerable. Because it did not own physical foundries, its entire value was locked in pure intellectual property, and intellectual property could be bought with a single wire transfer. The pressure reached its breaking point in the summer of 2016. Following the turbulence of the June 2016 Brexit referendum, the British pound suffered a steep and immediate depreciation against international currencies. British corporate assets suddenly became significantly cheaper to foreign buyers overnight. Capitalizing on this currency shift, Masayoshi Son, the billionaire founder of the Japanese multinational conglomerate SoftBank, moved swiftly. In July 2016, SoftBank approached ARM's board of directors with a cash offer that stunned the global financial markets. $32 billion, roughly $24 billion, to acquire 100% of ARM Holdings. It represented a staggering 43% premium over the company's closing share price. For ARM's board and institutional shareholders, the temptation was insurmountable. The financial return was immediate, undeniable, and immense. In Cambridge, long-serving engineers watched with quiet dismay as the company that had carried the torch of British computing innovation for nearly 3 decades was swept into a foreign acquisition. There was no public debate, no industrial strategy intervention from Whitehall, and no domestic white knight capable of matching SoftBank's capital offer. The United Kingdom government, eager to signal that post-referendum Britain remained open for business, offered no regulatory resistance. A technology ecosystem that had taken nearly 40 years to build, tracing its lineage directly back to the BBC Computer Literacy Project and the wooden ICT desks of British schools, was sold off without a fight. The buyout was executed with clinical efficiency. The corporate headquarters remained notionally in Cambridge, and SoftBank pledged to retain the local engineering headcount. But the ultimate sovereign control over the foundational intellectual property of modern mobile computing had permanently left British hands. The global developers kept their platforms. The smartphone manufacturers kept their supply chains. The billions of users worldwide noticed no interruption in their daily digital habits. But the country that had engineered the architecture no longer owned the company that made it. The boardroom voted. The documents were signed. The capital crossed the ocean. The British ownership ended in a single morning. The chip remained. The company was no longer British. The classroom computer had died long ago. The architecture survived it. The sovereign control was gone. Yet out of this profound structural loss, something unexpected survived in the laboratories, museums, and memories of Britain. The corporate entity of Acorn Computers is long gone. Its physical hardware division was liquidated for a fraction of its true value at the end of the 1990s, and the brand name disappeared completely from the British high street and educational catalogs. ARM, meanwhile, remains one of the most universally recognized names in global technology. Its corporate headquarters is still physically located in Cambridge, employing thousands of engineers in a massive modern complex. Yet it operates as a sprawling, multi-billion-pound global entity heavily tethered to international financial markets and foreign capital. Its sovereign British identity was permanently erased by that summer morning acquisition in 2016. The paradox is absolute. The original company that built the physical computer was destroyed by global standards. The spin-off company that only sold the intellectual property conquered the world but became too large to keep its nationality. Today, the physical legacy of Britain's boldest computing revolution survives largely through dedicated enthusiast networks, vintage computing forums, and highly specialized preservation institutions. At places like the Center for Computing History in Cambridge and the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park, the original Acorn hardware is carefully maintained and displayed. In these quiet galleries, volunteers meticulously repair aging motherboards, replace failing capacitors, and keep the heavy CRT monitors glowing. Visitors can still sit at a heavy wooden desk, press the mechanical keys of an Acorn Archimedes, and watch the RISC OS desktop snap instantly to life. Online, the legacy is equally persistent. The RISC OS Open project continues to update and maintain the operating system that once powered those classroom machines, while software emulators allow a fiercely loyal, niche community of British programmers to run classic educational software on modern global PCs. But this intense preservation effort is not simply driven by a shallow nostalgia for the 1980s, nor is it merely a stubborn refusal by a generation of bedroom coders to let go of old-school computers. The Acorn Archimedes, the BBC Micro, and the early ARM architecture matter immensely today because they represent a fundamentally different, completely vanished philosophy of computing. They survive as physical proof of a time when technology was built to be completely understood by the human user. When a pupil sat at an Acorn machine in a school ICT room, the system invited them to look under the digital bonnet. It booted instantly into a programming language. It encouraged the user to write code, to manipulate memory directly, and to command the hardware without interference. Today, modern smartphones, powered by billions of invisible ARM cores, are entirely closed appliances. They are sleek, sealed glass slabs deliberately designed to consume streaming media, lock users into subscription models, and hide their internal logic behind App Store walls. The original British machines that birthed that mobile processor were open, accessible tools built on a powerful public service promise that computing should empower the user to create, not just endlessly consume. These old machines prove that the architecture that now locks us into tightly controlled global ecosystems actually began as a desktop computer designed to set a generation free. There is a striking, almost poetic historical footnote to this legacy. Decades after the BBC Computer Literacy Project ended, and long after Acorn had been dismantled, a new group of Cambridge engineers noticed a severe decline in technical education. British pupils were learning how to use software applications, but they were no longer learning how to code. In response, they designed a bare-bones, highly affordable microcomputer meant to revive that original, hands-on 1980s educational spirit. They called it the Raspberry Pi. When the Raspberry Pi launched to massive global success, eventually becoming the best-selling British computer in history, it did not rely on a generic American processor. It was powered by a low-cost, highly efficient ARM chip. The architectural DNA that Acorn had desperately engineered in a Cambridge office in 1983 had finally, quietly, returned to the British classroom. The ultimate tragedy of this British technology empire is not that it failed at the point of invention. The Cambridge engineers did not lack the vision, the technical brilliance, or the sheer capacity to outdesign the massive semiconductor foundries of Silicon Valley. They proved that a handful of brilliant minds with basic tools could change the trajectory of human communication. The failure lay entirely in the brutal, inescapable mechanics of scale. The United Kingdom could engineer the fundamental blueprint of the 21st century, but it lacked the vast industrial mass, the integrated consumer electronics giants, the aggressive high-street ecosystems, and the sheer capital depth required to maintain sovereign ownership of the empires it created. The technology was too important, too ubiquitous, and too profitable to remain a local asset. Britain did not stop inventing the future. It simply lost the corporate and industrial system that turned brilliant local invention into permanent, independent global scale. Somewhere in a British loft, an Acorn Archimedes still rests inside a softened, water-stained cardboard box. Its heavy, dark plastic casing remains cool to the touch, the Acorn logo slightly faded on the keyboard. It sits in the dark, waiting for a school classroom that no longer exists, entirely disconnected from a digital future that was built on the very logic permanently wired inside its silicon motherboard. See you in the next one.